great to have you all with us, especially since this is basically our one and only physically present event this year with the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought, of which I'm one of the co-directors. And I'm especially pleased this time that we've collaborated with Holloway's Center for Continental Philosophy, of which Nathan Witter here is a member.
Yeah, Henry directs it,
but this hopefully is a first of our hopefully of many collaborations to come. And thanks to them, we have this spot in central London where I hope we'll have more events to come. So anyway, thank you all once again for coming. It's my great pleasure to sort of start everybody's summers off also with today's talk, which will be delivered by Professor Babette Babich, who is visiting us from Fordham University in New York City, and as well as the University of Winchester, where she is a visiting professor in the Department of Theology, Religion, and Philosophy. So I'm sure Professor Babich doesn't really need that much of an introduction. She's published widely on Nietzsche, on more broadly also philosophy and science technology from a continental perspective, in addition to aesthetics from especially sculpture and music, English as ancient philosophy. She's published many books on Nietzsche in both English and German, as well as editing a journal, the Nietzsche Studies Journal. And she's also co-edited and edited collected volumes on David Hume's Standard of Taste, as well as the physicist philosopher Patrick Aidan Heelan's The Observable, Heisenberg's philosophy of quantum mechanics. Today's talk, I believe, is drawn from a very provocative conclusion that she wrote to her one of her most recent books on Günther Anders, philosophy of technology. Günther Anders is somebody who is direly understudied in the Anglophone sphere. And it is my great pleasure to have Professor Babich here today to introduce, probably to most of us, the work of Günther Anders, which I think with today's talk, Apocalyptic Thinking After Günther Anders, is an extrapolation, I believe, of the conclusion to the book that was published in 2022. So with that being said, please join me in welcoming Professor Babich.
I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I also thank Nathan for finding me, and I'm also grateful very much for the water which you brought. Thank you very much. I've been here before, but it was too long ago, and the Germans have a great saying that when something is that long ago, it is no longer true. It was what it wasn't. The book is this book, and it's just got out in paperback. It's print on demand, so for some reason the print is faded, I think. And I'm going to be talking about, in part, the conclusion, but it actually goes further, because one of the things that happens, and those of you who are writing dissertations or who have written them will know that you keep writing after you have finished, and so nothing is ever completed. You go back to it, you change it, you take up another thing, do something else. And this is that. So, concerning the bomb. The bomb is the problem, and of course, the phrase, or apocalyptic blindness, is Anders' phrase. It's a quote. Günther Anders spent his post-war life talking about the wrong things when it came to practical matters, like the getting of a job as an emigre, because then as now, and even if you're native to the land, it's the same. If you write about the wrong things, or say the wrong things, no one will hire you, except by accident. And I'm going to argue that Günther Anders does something further. He offers, here's a picture of the guy when he was young, a different political theology. We usually use the word political theology, and we're talking about the subject matter of my late husband, of Tracy Strong, which would be Carl Schmitt, So there's a big echoes of that, obviously, in what we're going to hear about. But this is different. As a political theology, it's neither an otherworldly, nor a Gnostic, nor, that's also different, a salvific that becomes Jonas, solemn, messianic, but following from what he called our Promethean shame. Philosophical anthropology, very honestly, as such, given what the human being can fashion in its hallmark capacity to annihilate. We're really good at destroying things. By contrast with divine creatio ex nihilo. 11 years after the war had ended, writing in 1956, 6 years after the Germans manifested their economic miracle, to use the language we use today, by minting their beautiful 50-penny coin, Anders was still talking apocalypse. Even more problematically, he was talking about the bomb in his book, Die Antiquiertheit, there's Menschen, a strange title then, a strange title now, the antiquatedness. People keep mistranslating it because no one really understands German. It's very tragic. They talk about the obsolescence. That's not what it means. The antiquatedness of the human being. He concluded the book concerning the bomb and the roots of our apocalyptic blindness, and I have stolen shamelessly for this first section title from that. It's his book that I took from. Today, with a constantly stoked disaster mindset, we seem to see nothing but apocalypse after apocalypse. Long past zombies and vampires, we enthusiastically binge Black Mirror, pretend to ourselves that the Turing test has been conclusively trumped, and we should now all debate the resident Twitter bots. We shouldn't determine if they're Twitter bots, we should just talk to them and occupy our time that way. Or at least we should properly cite ChatGPT. We are good at thinking COVID or the next new virus as apocalypse, AI as apocalypse, climate change as apocalypse, even aliens. These days in New York, they're moving tanks throughout the land as apocalypse. They don't have that many flying saucers, but they have a lot of tanks. For Anders, what continued to matter after 2 demolitions in 1945 was the halving of the bomb for the US and for other nations that hastily followed suit. And one needs a Tom Lear song. And in his 1965, that was the year that was, album, Tom Lear captures Anders' verbal precision, a bomb, as opposed to a device, then possessed by China and soon to be Israel et al. As Anders underlines, this is not that about which one might say, as one says with moral conviction of the Holocaust, never again. The bomb has already happened again and again, as Anders insisted, manifold and multiplied, accelerated. Thus, for students of international relations and government, when the current war in the Ukraine first broke out, I already mentioned him, my late husband, Tracy Strong, who was Kissinger's assistant, let's make that very clear, immediately observed that in February of 1990, the then Secretary of State, James Baker, under the first regime, we could say, of the first President Bush, offered an ironclad, that was their words, promise crucial for the reunification of Germany in 1991, where I was teaching in Tübingen, and it worked. Of course, it worked to reunify Germany. And of course, the promise was not kept. Nor were matters any different when it came to the nuclear ban test treaty. As Anders insisted, talking about the thousands of tests known to have taken place since 1945, promise or no promise. Son of a family of psychologists, both his mother and his father, Anders regarded our apocalypse blindness as the result of collective trauma, a perfected esvar. The having of the bomb was one part of this, quite in addition to our, and I mean the Allied use of, that's America's having used the bomb. Today one can mean to keep the nuclear option on the table, as Hillary Clinton phrased the option during her last US presidential campaign contra the much-hated Donald Trump, no one is fond of him, or the arguments today swept away as conspiracy theories speculating on mini-nukes used in Oklahoma, 1995, or to take down the World Trade Center. The theologian I have to emphasize this because this is Goldsmiths, or part of it anyway was, David Ray Griffin wrote book after book about 9/11, so Whitehead reference, beginning with the new Pearl Harbor. When he wasn't a theologian, he was what we now call, for some insane reason, a conspiracy theorist rather than a theorist. He just wrote 9 books about that conspiracy theory. And such arguments continue to be made when dramatic mini mushroom cloud explosions, such as that in Beirut, are blamed on piles of chemicals or fertilizer instead. New bombs. New rules. From atonal music to the electronic composition Epitaph for Eikichi Kuboyama, co-written by Anders and Babette Babich. Where the opposition Anders maintained throughout his life against the bomb was sometimes expressed nakedly, as if the specification was supererogatory, Anders focused on the cleaner bombs that counted as new and improved. The contradictio in ejecto intrigued him. Like the locution of gain of function, these technologically improved bombs were better because less efficient, controlled demolition being the main idea, learned by government, lots of them, after the mess of 2 world wars, all those bodies, all that rubble. The idea henceforth would undertake apocalypse slowly, which, like killing people slowly, allowed for broader deployment but also deniability. Anders objected to the locution of test. He argued that to detonate a nuclear device is to use it, not to test it. We call it a trial only consequent to our blindness to the collateral damage caused by military tests, to ocean life. It's been and it continues to be massively fatal, or desert life, but who knows, it's under the water. Likewise fatal, or even complex as this is to imagine underground. In the wake of the March 1st, 1954, that's before he writes his book, Castle Bravo, largest bomb ever, thermonuclear weapon test at Bikini Atoll, the fishermen and the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands suffered long-term consequences, fatal and otherwise. To discuss this, Anders conjures an inscription, a memorial in words for Eikichi Kuboyama, who died on the 23rd of September 1954. He was exposed only, remember, on March 1st, so long, as first victim, as he was called, of the hydrogen bomb, diminishing the danger from the fallout of a bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the original dropped on Hiroshima. Edward Teller, he was working on other bombs, as one as he was working on, insisted that it's unreasonable to make such a big deal over the death of a fisherman. Poetically repetitive, Anders says the name to let it be a memory, as he says, quote, for our brief time. Unsere kurze Frist, Eikichi Kuboyama, in one of the early footnotes in his 1956 Antiquiertheit, is mentioned inscription, as you see it here, on the memorial stone for this first victim, Gedenkstein für dieses erste Opfer der Wasserstoffbombe in Batavia, which is Jakarta currently. But the problem, of course, with all of that is that it's not an inscription written anywhere. He just made it up. It's a footnote. At issue is the protracted death from radiation sickness and from anything that takes any kind of time. This is how deniability or apocalyptic blindness works in ordained practice. As the analytic, and you have to be an analytic philosopher to do this, as the analytic philosophical authors, that's one of the victims, as you see, Eikichi Kuboyama's family, less Herbert Imert, sorry, more Herbert Imert. There he is, good old Herbert. This was Köln, Cologne, great stuff. Yes, it does. Sorry, there it is. That's the book I'm looking for. Merchants of Doubt. How a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. This technique was used by Big Tobacco and Dow Chemical, and we can add, they don't add, they wouldn't, Big Pharma, as corporate legal defenses used preemptive government agreements rendering manufacturers immune from liability, and in the case of litigation raised, that's all you need to do for the law, the question of doubt, hence the title, Merchants of Doubt, in the face of any and all accountability claims. For Anders, the concern was logical, not merely calculated supererogation, stockpiling nuclear armaments is also all about that, because they will, all of them, need to be replaced by newer and better versions. But the manufacturing, already mentioned this point, he really never lets it go, he repeats this, of newer weapons deliberately designed to do less damage. Qua the anti-personnel but material-sparing neutron bombs, he says, today's efforts to produce so-called clean weapons are attempts of a unique kind, for what man is now doing is to increase the quality of his products by decreasing their effects. For Anders, the comparative locution is oblivious to its own incoherence. He says, death is the boundary line of the comparative. One cannot be deader than dead, and one cannot be made deader than dead. He was writing this from America, where people say that all the time. And his epitaph for Akichi Kubayama commemorates Kubayama, who months later died of radiation poisoning. Collateral means anything that takes weeks or months or years to take effect. Think mRNA, we all should be thinking of that, but also think lipid nanoparticles and think chemtrails and think Monsanto's glyphosate. All of that may be discounted. As a parenthesis in Anders' spirit, I recommend you listen to, there are several YouTube videos, Eimert's 1960-1962 composition with Anders, Epitaph for Akichi Kubayama, as it's worth both seeing and hearing in a musicological context. And I include an excerpt. This is 1924, Eimert's wonderful Atonale Musiklehre, because you have these 11 tonalities to help you understand 12 tone maybe for the first time, whereby the 12th sums to 7,909,426 possible forms. That's very important, phenomenologically keyed. This is Husserlian Abschattungen for the composer, for the ear, as it were, and may, if we make the effort to hear it, teach us via Eimert's collaboration with Anders to listen, zuhören, through echoes and repetitions, as the composition is itself layered and composed again and again. We have to repeat. This is the new music, the music no one listens to this day. We have to keep listening. Sorry about that. The sustainedly positive, negative Heideggerian double coordination is needed to reflect on the post-apocalyptic condition, as if, like the postmodern, we were already living this. Postmodernity only makes sense in an eschatological precision of the end time that was announced, and then assurance, for the first time it was announced, proximate prediction, which did not then, as Jacob Taubes, 1923, he died in 1987, carefully traces this in his hermeneutic of the Gospels. The idea of a rabbi reading the New Testament is hermeneutically key. As Taubes, a rabbi from Switzerland, in a long line, he was born in Vienna, of Viennese rabbis, read between the Jewish tradition and the Christian Bible to offer a theological textual exposition, just to note that that end time then did not and still has not arrived. Anders spends much of his reflection on this last point in one of his last texts on the post-atomic age at the end of his life. In an early reflection, as I said, he did this all his life, his entire life long. Very annoying he must have been, even possibly more annoying than Taubes was, and I knew Taubes that he was. Theses on the atomic age, Anders loved little lists, as if coining an array of commandments from time to time can seem unrelenting. He insists that we have no reason to trust supposed experts over and over again, making reading Anders surprisingly contemporary. No reason to follow or trust the science. At issue for Anders is with those who are doomed to die. He loves Latin, the moituri, compass in their moral imagination versus those in power. Or he says, there is no more final and no more fatal proof of moral blindness than to deal with the apocalypse as if it were a special field, and to believe that Reich is identical with the monopoly to decide the to be or not to be of humankind. Some of those who stress competence are doing so solely in order to disguise the anti-democratic elements of their monopoly. By no means should we be taken in by this camouflage. At the time, Anders was talking about Adenauer, who did not want, he was very clear about this, the little people That includes academics meddling with the decisions of the higher ups. You should know your betters. In an era in which mass compliance, not opting to opt out, has been rendered second nature. After 3 years, we're really good at going along with whatever is asked. Universal compliance becomes, or is mandated to become, habitual. This acceptance is automatic on, from computer cookies and internet browsing to airport scanners. When was the last time you saw anyone opt out at the airport? And soon to be digital health passports to masks and vaccines and so on. It's salutary to recall Anders' reflection on the already given and crucially precisely self-imposed work, we do it ourselves, of techno-conformity presupposed for anything I've been talking about to be possible. Such techno-conformity, and this drives digital banking initiatives and passports, accords with what Anders spoke of as negative anthropology. Anders' point in the antiquatedness of the human is that it is not they, not a Heideggerian point, who do this to us, but we who do this to ourselves and constantly surveilled. We are ourselves the surveillance to those around us. If you see something, say something. It's all around the New York subway. Underground. Anders thus parses Hegel's vision of the motor of history by way of the Kojevian context, whereby the individual might be elevated beyond Abrahamic walking with and being before deity, not incomparable to the Titan Prometheus defeated, as Anders claims, by Hegel's agonistic symbolism, whereby, henceforward, and I cite the English translation, Being Without Time. It's been available for a long time. People could have read it. Before many people here were born, they could have read it. Man is now seen as a pair of men, that the individual who is a metaphysical self-made man had fought a Promethean struggle against the gods has now been replaced by men who fight each other. It is they who are now regarded as reality. For to be now means to dominate and to struggle for dominion, and they alone are seen as the motor of time, for time is history, and history in the eyes of dialectical philosophy owes its moment exclusively to antagonism between man and man, or class and class, so exclusively that at the moment when these antagonisms came to an end, history itself would cease too. Let's call this the eschatological effect. In another context, this is the backward working effect that should, Anders argues, compel our attention, as he thinks time today, time yesterday, and time tomorrow, knotted together in what has become the end time. This runs throughout his Die Atomare Drohung, the atomic threat, and is repeated on the last page of the final chapter, Die Frist, and the Frist is very important, deadline if you like. It may seem a bit of a come down. After the ancient tribulations of the Titan Prometheus, to consider the contest between two nations at war as these are staged or enacted before us, Jean Baudrillard's analyses in 1995 being here an important counterpoint to qualify and thus arguably to begin to understand what is currently taking place. On social media, as this is also and simultaneously, if non-identically, in so-called real life, with real-life casualties and real-life deaths, in the Ukraine and Crimea, as such also continues in Israel, on and among the Palestinians affected by the conflict and elsewhere, and so on. Negative ontology and the politics of nuclear power. And this embodies a tradition of reflection, including the negative ontological musing on the future of time, as the apocalypse continues to shift, as Anders takes some pains to underline the transformation from mere metaphor, that's what it's always going to be for theologians, to an objective and serious literality, an unmetaphorical meaning ever since Stunde Null, Year Zero, 1945. This objective danger remains for Anders, even if the destructive power of the devices in question yields something less than, we should think of the mindset of the scientists who coined this convention, quite technical term, totality. Who uses that word, totality? Why do they use it? Uncanny, as this is. The door in front of us bears the inscription, "Nothing will have been," and from within, time was an episode. Very important reflection. Not, however, as our ancestors had hoped, between two eternities, this is Anders, but one between two nothingnesses, between the nothingness of that which, remembered by no one, will have been as though it had never been, and the nothingness of that which will never be. And I have to go back to that because Anders doesn't tell you, because he doesn't say that he's quoting him, but he is quoting him, and that is the unpublished Nietzsche. Ein hiatus, gap or breadth or space between two nothingness. The problem for Anders is that where we are experts on nihilism, we stumble when it comes to thinking apocalypse, no matter how suffused we are by apocalyptic signifiers. Thus, surrounded by nihilism for almost a century, for Anders, we are thereby surrounded by a movement that has so driven the nihil into the foreground that it has gotten us used to thoughts of annihilation. Did not these nihilists prepare us at all for what, in order to prevent it, we must now come to apprehend, just to grasp and to learn? As Anders characterizes his nihilists at the end of his reflections, he's going to use a later name, it's called, but he repeats it again, he publishes it again, Endzeit und Zeitenende, and time and the end of time. He clarifies that he's thinking of the Russian nihilists, that's his specification. The reference is flattened, all patent metonymic allusion included. In a 1956 footnote, he really writes too much stuff in the footnotes, on the antithesis between the Apollonian and the Dionysiac principle. As he precises, the former denoted the happy harmony of the finite, the latter the intoxication found in exploding the boundaries of the finite. Since we are no longer finite, and since we have the explosion behind us, the antithesis has become unreal. This reflection is complex beyond Nietzsche's trademark affirmation, whereby such legacy nihilism, as it were, quote, appears as that of one of the good old nihilists. Anders writes this in English in the original, indeed, that of the optimists. To this extent, beautiful Vietnam, as Anders writes, referencing Benjamin, who is referencing the Italian futurist Marinetti, with its napalm and its massacres, just to remember the reported ones we know about, certainly deserves the film that, at least in fiction, epitomizes American intervention in a century that has proceeded into another century of intervention. The word sounds as if one had taken some intrusive but somehow tactical and helpful action. Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 Apocalypse Now. Music is not a mere illustration here, and Friedrich Kittler details the continuing influence of the vocoder, tracing it back to the Second World War. Thus Kittler, not unlike Anders' own earlier allusions, different in context, is fond of esoteric pop music references, which are really avant-garde, with respect to Laurie Anders. She's very much avant-garde, different, one more time, Oh Superman, pointing out that Stockhausen, this is Kittler, couldn't dispense with the abuse, that's quote, of military equipment, explaining that human years are a weapon, that's quote. Anders, Adorno, and the psychologist, art theorist Rudolf Arnheim, and every Protestant preacher would agree, the ears are a direct path to the heart and mind. The trouble with thinking any such reference to music and sound, or the Kittlerian or Andersian, and he doesn't look like this any longer, nobody ever looks like this any longer. And as I write right now I do write about him, the Scottish electronic music artist and Warwick philosopher, PhD, Steve Goodman, Code 9. The trouble is history, and it is philosophy. For us today, even as we Americans have used such sonic weapons, we have a lot of them, we use them in Afghanistan. My students in New York tell me about how they use them. It's very depressing. As sonic cannons are used to devastate cetacean life in the oceans, and acoustic deterrence devices, which is what we call them, keep seals and dolphins with deadly consequences from the greed and filth of Scottish farmed salmon and other fisheries. We suppose that trumpets could never bring down the walls of a city, just as we do not think the advertising we hear on the radio, or actually these days the advertising music we choose to stream via social media when we click on things, has any effect on our minds or choices or thinking. This is inaccurate, as Horkheimer and Adorno, that's the point of critical theory, and Anders repeated again and again. And I wrote a book, The Hallelujah Effect, all about the music, but still, we don't believe it. It's difficult, it is, if it is, to think the effects of the media we're soaking in, addicted as we are to our phones. Eschatology is worse. It is difficult to think an end time, not merely because, as has been observed, one can scarcely look such a prospect face on, quite like looking at the sun, a metaphor for the deployment of the bomb from the outset. And this argument is contra the Protestant theologian Bultmann to argue that we cannot invoke a substitution of eschatological Christianity with an existential He knew Heidegger called, it will not work. More is at stake, and the ingeniousness of negative theology is likewise at a limit. What's at stake for Anders is the exclusive dominion of the Western conception of time, beginning with August. In a section entitled The End of the End, Anders writes, as long as the course of time was understood cyclically in all cultures in the world, in fact, apart from ours, post-birth Christ, of course, the Greeks certainly, Egyptians certainly, it was assumed as unavoidable that the starting point would always be newly attained and the same course to be run through anew. The concept end was not possible. Where it emerged, as in the Stoic theory of ek piohosis, even the second sophistic, and meant at the same time beginning. Anders continues through the expectation of an ultimate and gültigen end. Thus, via eschatological anxiety and hope, history has become a one-way street, excluding repetition. But, as he says, as it not only could not attain any old point of departure, but couldn't attain an end, it transpired that exactly that which owed its existence to the concept of the end became the principle of the answer. That explains Slavoj Žižek right there, before Slavoj Žižek started. And it prepared precisely the end of the possible end. No guarantee was as eternally safeguarded for us as the guarantee of eternally continuing time. This guarantee is now fallen apart. Anders compares eschatological and religious visions of apocalypse with the more prosaic or everyday difference of the same. He explains it, he unpacks it for us. And one more time, he likes to add numbers. This is third in a little list that goes on. At the time for Paul, the experience of the world, das Dasein der Welt, in the time between the crucifixion and the second coming, was taken to be a mere still existent, loses noch Dasein. Then as today as then, the world between Hiroshima and total nuclear war is indeed still there, but only still there. Given his trademark intensification, Anders goes on to differentiate between ancient legacy, apocalypse, often but not only religious, and the current thinking of apocalypse. Back then, the end was something that was merely indebted to humans. This time, per contra, it is something directly made by humanity. Back then, the expected end was caused by guilt. Remember Bernard Williams' very important distinction. This time, per contra, the guilt consists in the manufacture of the end. In 1962, again, those commandments for the atomic age, Anders backdated this guilt to the end of World War II, which had already ended on May 8th with the surrender of Germany, on August 6th to end it again, a second time, 1945. That is Transfiguration Day, as the Christian calendar designates an overdetermined date, almost as if, and Friedrich Kittler emphasizes, he repeats this, that just this was calculated by the American military. One had chosen, he argues, Kittler, the specific day, why this day, why not the 5th, for what would be the first ground zero and the time zero, that Stunde Null we just heard. On August 6, 1945, the day of Hiroshima, a new age began, the age in which at any given moment we have the power to transform any given place on our planet, and even our planet itself, into a Hiroshima. On that day, we became, at least modo negativo, omnipotent. But since, on the other hand, we can be wiped out at any given moment, we also became totally impotent. However long this age may last, even if it should last forever, it is the last age, for there is no possibility that its differentia specifica, the possibility of our self-extinction, can ever end, but by the end itself. Anders' end time, and the end of time. Anders' Talmudism is evident, as he criticizes the faith in progress, and Anders could have had, this requires more research, people should write more dissertations, with Blumenberg and with the Tübingen-based Ernst Bloch, in addition to Taubes. Thus, Anders reflects on the involution of theological argument, just as he had earlier argued in Being Without Time, that's his text, that a non-proof, a lack of proof, became the best theological confirmation. Sorry about that. That would have been easier. I didn't go there. Since the state of affairs, this is the quote, that was just my text, we have reached allegedly already contains the seeds of the inevitably better. We live in a present in which the better future has always already begun. No, we're virtually already in the best of all worlds, since something better than that, which inevitably improves, isn't even conceivable. This is similar to unpacking the problems besetting the delayed second coming. Thus, and we've heard this before, transposed today into technological salvation, which salvation, so we are informed, has already happened. Today, we worry about AI rather than robots. Robots was yesterday's news. That was last year. We cared about robot ethics. Qua phantom, or as Nietzsche would argue, a projection, quite as our interaction with every other kind of intelligence, human and animal. AI can be everything we read into it. For Anders, in other words, for those that believed in progress, the apocalypse became superfluous since it was only ever necessary as a precondition for the kingdom. The most ingenious thing was that the present and the future were always intertwined. The kingdom always arrived because it was always already there. And it was always already there because it arrived continually. Anders uses the same language that you can find in Taubes' dissertation on Western eschatology, but Anders' tone is markedly different, true to his name, Anders, although we can certainly recognize the voice, one Jew speaking to another. Even though history only became history in its modern sense, that is to say, a history that has developed a sense of direction, because of the fact that the Christian expectation was oriented towards salvation, and even though their years count as holy years, factual history did not unfold as a process of salvation. The German is Heilsgeschehen. In reality, it proceeded as long as people didn't get used to the continuation of history and forget the expectation as a chain of holy disappointments, as a never-ending failure of the kingdom to come, as a continual practice of self-humbling in the face of the continued existence cosmo of this world. Nor does Anders spare the same language of scandal or of deadline, twist, as he speaks of this together with its specificity, timing, specific turning points, so as to save, as it were, not the phenomena headed for them, but the promise of salvation. Seen from a non-Christian standpoint, the fact that 2,000 years have passed is a scandal. Actually, this shouldn't have been allowed to happen unless that time was understood in the same way Jesus understood the time between the disciples' missions and their death, or similarly to Paul's apostolic time as a deadline, as the interlude which inserts itself between the Annunciation, or rather the crucifixion, and the parousia, second coming, or rather the interlude that must be inserted as the final time of convulsions, or as the time of Satan's triumph before the final judgment. Seen from a Christian point of view, in other words, eschatologically, Christianity lives after the birth of Christ, but in the era of the before. The problem is thinking apocalypse without kingdom, the end of time without the messianic, lacking kingdom come to declare the kingdom attained. I'm not reading this as a hermeneuticist used to reading textual loci, though I am that. I am a direct student of the very old Gadamer, because I am very old, as a reading between Gadamer and Taubes. And Anders. These men knew one another. More crucially than that, they read one another's books, which is something we don't do anymore. And that entails that there is always rivalry, even where one party is always already the winner and the other already the loser. Taubes, that's Taubes when he was very young. I didn't know him when he looked like that. Not that it was much better, but it doesn't. Would like to call himself a poor Job, was royalty, and Anders was not. He was the poor, the descriptor is always relative, and in Anders' case it was completely literal, cousin. They were direct cousins. One was 10 years older, Benjamin was 10 years older, cousin of Walter Benjamin, not second cousin, not third cousin. We need Taubes to read Anders as Taubes was among those for whom Anders wrote, counted Arendt, but also Heidegger and Jonas. Our apocalypse blindness, as Anders names it, our scotosis, to use a Thomist term, blocks the thought he is advancing, quite in addition to our fact of continuing with or without faith in a kingdom to come. Note the reference to Paul and argument Taubes himself, along with Paul Lewis, and again Hans Jonas, along with other unnamed names, had already made, and we need this to catch the style, the irony of Anders' point, that the Perusio wouldn't proceed in the form of a world catastrophe, but rather as an event in people. When Paul and his followers experienced death and resurrection with Christ in baptism, believing themselves to already be a part of the kingdom of God, then the decisive moment was already obviated within worldly. Anders refers to theologians, especially the proponents of negative theology, which he reads brilliantly, I think. For Anders, in straight ontic reality, what's at stake is not Godot's arrival infinitely deferred, but a change given what we human beings have. It matters that Anders' doctoral dissertation was on the very idea of having, given what we have done and what we continue to manufacture very negatively, in order not to have to do it again post-1945. As the 2,000 bygone years have proved, Anders writes, the threat back then was merely imaginary. This time we're confronted with an unambiguous threat in the everyday technical sense that will come true unless we preempt it with a real and equally unambiguous answer-action. The dialogue, complete with Anders' citation from Thessalonians, thus my argument, I would submit this, I may be wrong, but I believe it's plausible, that Anders, writing from Vienna, which is where he lived the last years of his life, meant to address the Viennese-born Taubes. Taubes certainly kept a tolerance of these things, then teaching in Berlin, continues. Back then, it was said, we cannot expect the kingdom to arrive immediately, since the arrival represents a cosmic drama. The victory over the earth takes time. Even when it's already been fought for and won over in the heavens, it can only occur once Satan has already enjoyed his final convulsive triumph. But that day shall not come, except to come a falling away first. In short, the fact that the kingdom has far not come was virtually presented as evidence of its arrival. I've been arguing that to read Anders, we need to refer to Taubes and his theologians. Thus, Anders continues to argue, and Anders doesn't mention except vaguely, generally, the theologians, no matter how awe-inspiring this venerable history of eschatological hopes and fears may be. From Daniel's dream interpretation to socialism's hope for the kingdom of God, an actual threat of the world ending never existed. Despite the subjective seriousness with which these prophets spoke of danger, only today's threat of the end is objectively serious, so serious that it couldn't be more serious. Since that's the case, the question of which usage of the term end of the world or apocalypse is metaphorical and which usage it's not, must be answered so. It wasn't until today, or rather until the year 0, 1945, that these terms earned their serious and non-metaphoric sense, since only today do they name a real possible downfall. The German is Untergang. On the other hand, the concept apocalypse, which is still used in theology today, turns out to be merely a metaphor in hindsight. We could even say, this is Anders' point, that what was meant by this metaphor was until now, this is way modern, way death of God issue, to put it bluntly, a fiction. As I said, that sounds like a provocation, but he doesn't think you should reject this. Just above, I had reviewed very briefly Taubes' reflection on the turning, just where the Protestant in the equation, I mentioned his name already, Tracy Strong, the son of a Congregationalist minister, and not a rabbi, would have said the transfiguration of the whole history of Christendom is a history of the delayed second coming. As Thomas argues, the first date in Christian history can be taken to be, this is Taubes, the non-fulfillment of the prophecy of Jesus. So something that doesn't happen is the first date. This is the conjoining of gnosis and politics. Anders reads this differently, beginning from the same turning point Taubes specifies as intended by Jesus' prophecy as clear, and thus is not intended to be interpreted in a woolly manner. That is the same non-fulfilled prophecy Taubes cites from Paul, whom Nietzsche has already called the Disangel, revaluing Christ's promise as Evangel, encapsulating Taubes' argument in a single revaluative word. Nietzsche just does it with the word. As Anders explains, and I think you can hear the irony in Apocalypse without kingdom. Actually, Anders says, it dates back to that moment when Jesus sent out his disciples with the words, "You shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come," without the Son of Man having ever come. For the old world was still in place and it continued functioning. The disappointment over the failure of either the Parousia or the end to take place, or rather the disappointment over the continuation of the world, was the model of disappointment that would last for centuries until the Parousia was finally reinterpreted into something that had already happened. Like in the representations of the resurrection and end of the world in the 3rd and 4th centuries, which regarded the expected as something that already happened. The future was already part of the past. Anders' point is Tauber's point, turned upside down. To borrow the formula, an inversion like a glove, I'm taking this from the musicologist, philosopher Daniel Charles, French Fordhamist, writing on Olivier Messiaen, who composed On the End of Time. And as quite as a Heideggerian who knew what this entailed, pointed out that however it might be named, this ambiguity, this puzzle, was a lie. Actually, the non-Parousia of Christ has made the apocalyptic component of faith unbelievable for the last 1,500 years. Bultmann's replacement of eschatological Christianity with an existential one is but the latest iteration of an apocalypse neutralization, which has actually existed since Augustine. For Augustine, the church was, the Civitas Dei, the kingdom come, by virtue of its arrival, made the hope for the second coming of superfluous. You know, already in Paul's time, the concept and image of apocalypse were ambiguous. For Anders, all of this is history as futurology. Thinking progress or technology gets in the way of thinking apocalypse. This we cannot see head on, which makes it a matter of kairos. This is the image I used in my first draft of the poster, made yet more beautiful by Julia's stunning design. One more time. Back then, the eschatological hope constituted the course of history since the ancient cyclical nature of time, which had been forbidden for all of history, was abolished, aufgehoben, by the fact that whatever remained would course forwards down a one-way street in the direction of the kingdom. Anders is not sympathetic to Jacob Taubes' reading, arguing on the contrary that one needs to think what history is and how history comes to be. It's a very Heideggerian point. You actually have to write history, whereby eschatology allows us to add periodization, punctuation, divisions. When we anticipate the end, we anticipate the end of history. To put it differently, since God's kingdom was guaranteed only by the sacrificial death of Christ, this death transformed the entire period of time preceding this guarantee, all those years up to the 2023 years that reached now, are nothing. Just before. We don't count. This is something old times, ancient, antique studies. Or to invent the Old Testament. This is how, as Tracy would say, to write scripture. This is also, for Herbert Butterfield fans, the meaning of the Whig interpretation of history, or better said, how it works at all. How it's possible as part of the progress ideal, ethos, or myth, which is then effectively colonialization of the past. History was made possible, Anders says, because the world's events could now be articulated into two time periods, or count the time till the final judgment is another time period, then even in three. For us, on the other hand, the possibility of the end transforms the already completed past into something that was there as if it had never happened. This means it was retroactively dehistoricized, if not sit veni verbo, language, de-ontologize. This takes us to thinking Anders on science. We already had a slide using the definitive article, the, to understand the central role of faith in the science. Writing in italics, the belief that the age of faith has been superseded by the age of science is a superstition. Amongst us lay people, it's only the object of faith that has changed. This is a fairly important point because, of course, this matches what we're hearing this day, to this day, matching the pronouncements of television and mainstream media scientists. He could have been writing now, he wasn't. As for the scientists and technologists, they, of course, welcome the blind faith we place in them. They want nothing better. It's just as welcome as the blind faith of churchgoers was to the clergy. The similarity between the believers of today and us today is certainly striking, or the believers of yesterday. Through the media, and particularly through television, we have let ourselves be transformed into illiterates again. So we can't read for ourselves, we certainly to research for ourselves, we shouldn't question for ourselves, into post-literary illiterates. That means people capable of reading but who choose not to read just to trust the experts. Scientists and technologists, it goes on, desire nothing less than to speak in layman's terms. They attempt to withhold most truths by means of false classification with the appealing neologisms they devise, or by employing terminology that has long become invalid, or at least they attempt to obscure these truths even from themselves. This is particularly the case if they are employees serving those in power, i.e. employees of industry or the military, and because of the monstrous costs of research and the technologies based on it, this is almost always the case. Ouch. Our experts lie to us. Our clerics, that means our rabbis and our priests, our scientists, lie to us. Today, if we think, as we seem still to be unable to think of the fiction of coronavirus, as experts insist it's no fiction, just as they insisted at the outset that it was nothing like the flu or common cold or any other respiratory virus, just for the sake of insisting on Schmittian exceptions that no scholar of any rank challenged. I happen to have said a lot of things beginning at the start of the pandemic. Do you need a scholar of rank? The only one of rank was Giorgio Agamben. If we follow Anders' logic, this turn of affairs, and everybody hates him now, is concordant with clerical common scientific thinking. Thus we can understand language as it plays a role in Anders' later text, as he said, by coining neologisms, by preserving obsolete words or bringing them back to life. Scientists systematically prevent recognition of the truth, and thus, with varying levels of intent, they also destroy their own chance to recognize and understand. We may wish to avoid philology or hermeneutics, easy to do if we're not theologians or continental philosophers or lawyers. But if we do this, we are hoist on our own skyhooks a favorite viewpoint from nowhere for the analytic philosopher. And today, Anders' word on the media as fake news, as misinformation, remains timely. He writes, way before all of this, 1989, information of this kind, and this is true of almost all information circulated by the mass media, is actually an act of concealment. It is targeted prevention of the spread of information. Reading Anders is not about just one thing. One needs to read and reread Anders, learn his rhythms, his style in the process. The very fact that we reflect on our prospects for survival, post-apocalypse, that we imagine that the damage to the earth and its ecosystems caused by the heedless killing of animals and the far more egregious and just as unceasing elimination of habitat, as if carbon credits might make a difference to this crime already underway, already largely effected, as if switching to electric cars and electric cooktops might undo the damage done to the surface of the earth crisscrossed by roads and blacktop concrete and pointless construction, cities built for profit and never inhabited, ghost towns of expansion and cupidity, is part of that apocalyptic blindness. Thus our cure for our environmental panic under the mantra of climate change is the development of more technology, more mining, more destruction of the face of the earth. We want an education, a how-to for surviving a coming cascade of zombies or viruses, of invented pandemics to ensure governmental control, testing and varying mRNA and other genetic experimental protocols without ethical or scientific constraints for what to do in a time of shortage. The old song, our teacher David Allison liked this song, so I have to say it, included the refrain, "Think I'll eat some worms." I thought that was weird. Now, the imperative has shifted to bugs, as wretched a culinary prospect as the worms. If we ignore the apocalypse facing the wider insect kingdom, to rescue every bug you see, they need your help. This is the difficulty. Not merely farmed salmon, we should have farmed bugs, and we'll discover just what fresh new consequences to that might await us. But what for? Having advocated all the rules of human dignity and human freedom, why would it be necessary to provide for all the excess numbers of humanity? Could one not cull the herd? Notice how easy this metaphor has become after 3 years of talking herd immunity. Culling the human herd has been urged since Malthus and many others driving the zero population growth campaigns. Zero is zero. There's more to say. I've actually, even though this seems to have gone on too long, I did cut out a bit because I hope maybe that there might be questions. But there's a last sentence. For Anders, resolutely, if you picked up on that, pessimistic in thinking technology and the second coming, to acknowledge that we may not be able to save the day or the world or the whales, does not absolve us from making the effort. Thank you for your attention. I hope there might be a question.